What's up, y'all? I'm Will here with Schedulefly, and this is the Restaurant Owners Uncorked podcast, one of the highest rated hospitality podcasts in the world, brought to you by us at Schedulefly. We provide a very simple web-based restaurant employee scheduling software backed by legendary customer service. If you're on pencil and paper or Excel, or you're on some software with tons of bells and whistles and features you don't need or use, Schedulefly is the perfect place for you. Easy to use, point, click, and go, and we'll take great care of you. Schedulefly.com, free trial, check it out. Also, this podcast is brought to you by our sponsors, Pop Menu and The Giving Kitchen and Kickfin, and you're going to hear about them in just a minute. First of all, let's talk about today's guest. Hey, what's up, y'all? This episode is a really interesting episode. This is Sean Josephs, and not only does he own Char Number 4 and Maysville in New York, very, very successful restaurants, he's also the co-founder and master blender of Pinhook Bourbon. And we spent like an hour and a half talking, probably, half of that about restaurants and hospitality and his story and how he got into it, how he became a certified sommelier, and then how he got into bourbon, and why he and actually a friend of mine, a mutual friend who introduced us, why those two and their third co-founder started Pinhook Bourbon, and what Pinhook means, and how they're associated with thoroughbred horses. And it's just freaking awesome. This is a cool story. Sean's a sharp dude. He lives in New Orleans, and I had the chance to meet him and hang out with him once before. We've been talking about a lot of things lately. We're trying to help each other, which we didn't really even get into during this conversation. It's really more his story and what's happening in the world of bourbon and hospitality and everything in between. So this is an awesome episode. We had a good time talking. It's a long episode, and you're going to enjoy every bit of it. Thanks for listening. The busiest time of year is coming. Is your staff ready for the holiday rush? This year, give your team the gift of Pop Menu AI Answering, a simple solution for phones ringing off the hook. AI Answering handles calls 24/7, 365 days a year, so your staff can focus on in-person guests. Customize your greetings and responses, answer common questions, promote specials and events, and send follow-up links to ordering and reservations. AI Answering handles it all while escalating more complex conversations back to your team. Never miss another tasty revenue opportunity. Pop Menu, the marketing technology platform designed to make growing your restaurant easy. Discover more AI restaurant tools that turn your to-do list into an already done list by requesting a demo today. For a limited time, get $100 off your first month, plus lock in one unchanging monthly rate at popmenu.com. Go now to get $100 off your first month at popmenu.com. Be sure to tell them that Will from Restaurant Owners Uncorked podcast and Schedulefly sent you. Y'all, this is a great business. I just told you what they like me to say. I will say that we have a lot of mutual customers at Schedulefly with Pop Menu. They all agree. Great product, great customer service, great results. Check them out, popmenu.com. This episode is also brought to you by The Giving Kitchen. Giving Kitchen provides emergency assistance for food service workers through financial support and a network of community resources. Since its inception in 2013, Giving Kitchen has served over 15,000 food service workers and awarded over $10.5 million to food service workers in crisis. If you or someone you know is a food service worker in crisis, please ask for help. thegivingkitchen.org, and again, that's thegivingkitchen.org. Y'all, this is a phenomenal organization. Jen, the founder, has been on this podcast. Jen Heidinger Kendrick, check out that episode to hear their full story. But if you know somebody or you need help, go to thegivingkitchen.org. Incredible organization, and very responsive, and has a wonderful mission. Check them out. Wow, this is cool. I wish this would be a lot cooler if it had happened like it was supposed to today. So I was supposed to be down in New Orleans today, y'all, and was going to be able to hang out with Sean Josephs in person, but family life happens. And so luckily we have this cool studio that we can record from, and Sean's there in New Orleans, and I'm back here or staying here in Charlotte, and We get to do it over Zoom. So, Sean, what's up, man? Introduce yourself.
Hey, how's it going? Um, my name's Sean Josephs. I am the founder and master blender for Pinhook Bourbon. Um, been in that role for, I guess we're coming up on 10 years since we founded the company, which is crazy to me. Um, yeah, it's been an amazing journey because we started by just buying 20 barrels with your buddy Charles Fulford and another friend. That cost $9,000. It was back in 2011 when we bought the barrels. It was $465 a barrel for 3-year-old bourbon. For anyone who knows the market, it's a lot more than that now. So it's kind of one of those perfect, amazing things of where you just get together with a couple friends and say, "Hey, wouldn't it be cool if we had our own bourbon? I think we could put our heads together and do something unique and something that hasn't been done before." And here we are. I mean, we're still a small company, but you know, last year we dumped 1,200 barrels, so definitely more than 20. So it's been some good growth. But you'll appreciate this. I should say you'll appreciate this knowing Charles. The craziest thing to me about Pinhook is that it started as one of those slightly drunken conversations where you're like, you know what we should do that would be really awesome. And it's like, and we all know how many of those actually go anywhere.
Like less than 0.5%, right? This is when
well, yeah,
the reality hits the next day.
Yeah, and most of them too are even simpler things like we should go cross country skiing tomorrow, or we should go bowling tomorrow. Like most of them aren't even that aspirational. You're just feeling in good spirits, and you're like, you make some sort of plan, even a modest plan, and it still never happens.
All right, dude, we got a lot to unpack here. So before we even got to that conversation that y'all had, how did you get started initially? How and when in hospitality? You've had a really interesting career.
Yeah, so like most good things, it started with my better half. She opened a Spanish tapas bar in Manhattan called Tia Paul, which opened in the summer of 2004.
Okay.
And
what were you doing prior to that?
I was working in kind of branding and design agencies, and I was an account manager, and I absolutely hated it.
Yeah.
And it was just one of those things where, you know, go to college, graduate from college, lived in Japan for a year, traveled Southeast Asia, came back, lived in Telluride, Colorado for 2 years, working for the ski mountain, working for the golf course. And then at some point, you know, I was, and honestly was not getting any pressure from family, but I was just like, you know, like I already saw what Telluride was. I was like, I should at least try to get some sort of job. And I just, as those types of things go, it was a pure entry level job. I mean, I didn't really have any skills. I mean, I was a college graduate and I'd worked at the Mid Mountain Lodge and sold lift tickets and worked in a retail shop, but like I didn't have any like real skills. I mean,
where did you go to college?
I went to Colgate University for 1 year. Then I transferred to Colorado College in Colorado Springs.
Okay. How did you know? See, I want to say Chiba. I'll say Charles. We called him Chiba in high school. Wait, you went to? Did you know him when you went to Stab?
No, I mean we would have played him. You know, we would have played Woodbury Forest, but I did not know him for those days. Yeah, that came later. So anyway, it's like I don't know. I mean, I know this has happened to other people. All of a sudden, you have this career. Like I became sort of pigeonholed in a specific role, being an account manager, and I just, again, pure randomness. Most of the brands that I was working with were fashion and beauty, and I had zero interest in either of those two things. And sometimes I would wake up and go to work, and I'd be like, I used to like ski to work. Like now I'm in a meeting, and I'm not exaggerating, talking about this season's lipstick colors. And I'm just
were you in Manhattan at this point?
In Manhattan.
You moved to New York?
Yeah, I moved to New York. Because that was just where my one, like through my dad, it was a friend of a friend, essentially, who had just started by opening an agency. And I didn't know enough to say, and it was just like a job that paid $24,000 a year. And it was the job that I got, you know?
Yeah.
And it's funny, right? You don't know when you, I'm sure it happens to a lot of people. You wake up one day and you're like, I honestly have no idea why I'm doing this. I never had any interest in doing this. It just sort of happened to me.
Yeah.
You feel like, I mean, it's not true, right? I mean, it's like you have control, but I felt like I was just like, it's just the way the chips fell. Like, these are the circumstances. Now I'm an account manager living in New York City, specializing in fashion and beauty. And I don't even understand what I'm doing.
Yeah.
I just don't like it. And I have no idea what else to do.
Went down the same path,
Um,
man. Yep. I got you.
yeah.
Sure.
So really the most fortuitous thing was my, well, it was fortuitous ultimately, but at the time it was pretty scary. My wife opened her restaurant in July 28th of 2004. And then I got fired. I say fired because let go sounds soft. Like, I was fired. I mean, it wasn't like some big thing happened, but I lost my job, and at the agency I was working at the time. So in a way, that was a huge. Um, I mean, it was great in the sense that I was like, oh, good, I don't have to do this job anymore. But I had no idea what I was going to do, and so I ended up, for not knowing what else to do, running food at my wife's restaurant. And so, for anyone listening who's never worked in a restaurant, I mean, being a food runner is exactly like it sounds. It's really the step after dishwasher. You literally just take the food from the kitchen to the table it's supposed to go to, and hopefully bring it to the right person if there are seat numbers. And that's it. You just like run around and roll silverware and carry bus tubs down to the dishwasher and run more food and clear bus tables. And, you're just running around. But as someone who grew up playing a lot of sports, to me, it was the closest thing to, like, it's like a team sport. There's a lot of camaraderie.
Mm.
It's really physical. I mean, you're just on
Yep.
your feet, like you're just
It's a
moving and
lot of movement.
hustling.
You're hustling around.
Yeah.
Yep.
And I loved it. I absolutely, that was for me, that was my moment where I was like, oh, I found my calling. Like, this is for me. And I didn't even really, at that time, I didn't really understand. I didn't know enough about it to know, like, in what capacity. I was just maybe feeling this is the first time I've done something that is considered to be work, that I know it's such a cliche, but that I did think it was fun.
Well, look, I mean, that's where a lot of people find, I mean, again, over 500 episodes, there's like 95% of the people I've had on this podcast. That's where it started. It was some 14-year-old got a job washing dishes, or
Yeah.
18, or got a job during college to make it. But there's a certain number of people that have this wiring where you don't want to be in an office, you don't want to sit still, you
Yep.
like the commotion and the energy, and
Yep.
even the stress that comes with it, because you feel like at the end of the night you've accomplished something cool and you made people smile and the whole team kind of did something great, or
Yeah.
something messed up that night, but you learn and you get better, and tons of camaraderie, I mean, in good restaurants, good communication, good teamwork, good like
Oh
getting
yeah.
each other's
All those
backs, and
things.
then
I
you
mean,
also learn like how to keep your cool amidst the storm, which is a really valuable skill set no matter what you
absolutely.
do, right?
I mean, the other thing too is, for anyone who's worked I mean, actually, I think even if you worked in restaurants and you didn't like it, you'd have to acknowledge that time flies. You're busy. I mean, I guess the only time restaurants can be feel dull is if you're working a shift it's like nobody comes and you're just standing around. But generally speaking, if you're working in a restaurant and it's moderately busy, you're just going to run your ass off for, you know, 8 hours. You're just going to run. And then it's like, you'll never have that feeling of like you do when you're sitting at your desk. It's like,
Yeah, there's no desk job you can do where 8 hours passes as quickly as a restaurant. It's
no,
not even close.
no, not possible. And it's just like, I mean, I think even now too, right? We know so much about how important exercise is. And, it's like you're on your feet, you're moving. And sometimes you're
Yeah.
like, you are physically running, you're just up and down the stairs. And, it's like, eventually when I started working in bigger restaurants, and I became a sommelier. I'm jumping ahead, but like I would put on a pedometer and I would easily do 10 miles, you know.
In a day.
Yeah, easy.
Just hustling. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, so all right, so your wife opens a restaurant in Manhattan. So she
Yeah.
obviously had a lot of experience in that. Is that restaurant still there, or what happened with it?
Still there. Yeah, still
Yeah.
there. It's amazing. Yeah. Coming up on, yeah, so I mean, 19 years old will be 20 years this fall or this summer. So, or
But
not,
y'all,
sorry, not
you
this
live in,
summer, summer of next year.
but you live in New Orleans now. But y'all still have that.
Yeah, so her founding partner still lives in New York, and the way they've kind of divvied up the workload. Um, I mean, my wife is great on the floor, but has ended up taking on more of the sort of back office operational things from that standpoint. Um, so she goes to New York once a month, and then is just able to work remotely outside of that.
What's it called?
It's called Tia Paul. It's two words, TIA, and then POL.
Okay.
Yeah, it's a cool spot. I mean, now it's quite different, but when they opened, they were kind of cutting edge of Spanish food. I mean, it's a lot of classic Spanish dishes, but so much of what was available in New York through the lens of Spain was just like the guys with the cummerbunds and the sangria with the wooden spoon. And,
Yeah, right.
my wife had lived in Madrid for several years. And so it was really more of what you would have seen in Spain in terms of the approach. And so, but at the time that made it super unique in not just New York, but in the United States. So they had to, besides the fact that they've been open for 19 years, they were incredibly successful in a way that's probably hard to describe now because there was no social media and there was no Yelp.
Yeah.
So it was really just you could only really be written up in these larger publications and get into Time Out New York Magazine, New York Times, obviously, and then there was like a couple food blogs. Like it's just
right
now we kind of take it for granted that like if a new restaurant opens, you're just going to hear about it 7 million different ways mostly through your Instagram feed.
Yeah.
But back then you actually had to build it. Not trying to wax nostalgic. It's just the fact, like it was a different time. Like you just had to work it through just repeat guests and word of mouth and whatever. If you were lucky enough to be in the print, press, then,
Does she, where in Manhattan is it?
It's 10th Avenue and 22nd Street. And they've been at the same location the entire time.
Okay. Is that like lower?
It's called West Chelsea.
Okay.
And it's small too. They eventually added like a back room that they can use for sort of family style a la carte dining, but is also for events. But probably between the main restaurant itself is 42 seats, including the bar. And now it's maybe like you'd call it 60 seats, including the back room. But it's a very small, just like a little sliver of a restaurant. So
Well,
pretty cool.
I'm asking because I'm going up to New York next month.
Oh, you got to check it out. Yeah.
I want to go hang out there.
Oh, yeah, that would be amazing. We'll set you up there for sure.
I might try to pitch him some scheduling software. We'll see. No, I'm just kidding.
Absolutely,
so, okay.
You better.
So you're there doing that, and then you went from that to what happened next? Because that's a big jump running food to getting a master sommelier. That's
yeah. I don't say this. Now I can laugh about it, but I would say like that experience almost cost us our marriage because, it was, we didn't have any experience in restaurants. My wife had worked in restaurants, but had never managed one. And so being in the tip pool in your wife's restaurant and like, I was like, this is great. I'm having a great time. And she's like, this is miserable. And it was also a pretty big disconnect. They were getting tons of great press and her and her partner, their pictures in the New York Times and all these things are happening for them. And I'm just, and then just all the stress of owning and operating a busy, successful restaurant in New York and all of the challenges that come with that. And I'm just like running around like a little food runner being like, this is so much fun. This is great. Shut up. So, fortunately, our marriage survived But part of the reason is I realized I should not be working there, or maybe she told me I couldn't work there. It's the same difference. But anyway, because I had really decided that that was going to be my life's work, like I was like, this is it for me. The thing that made the most sense to me, and I don't know, in hindsight, I don't know if I was right or wrong, but it worked out for me, was I felt like I needed to see restaurants at what I would say was the highest level, because I felt like I just wanted to see it. You know, Tia Paul, again, it's just casual tapas, food comes as it comes, very inexpensive. And I really wanted to see it, you know, maybe the opposite end of the spectrum. So I went to work at a restaurant called Chanterelle, which was in Tribeca. It closed in 2008, but they were open for 30 years. And when they initially opened, it was a French restaurant. And when they opened, it was super cutting edge because they were in Tribeca when there was nothing there. Like it was still sketchy. And here they were opening this kind of modern French restaurant, although very driven by classics. And they were, by the time I was working there, it had been demoted one star to 3 stars from the New York Times, but it was a 4-star restaurant. So at one point it was one of, 4 or 5 4-star restaurants in New York. And so they hired me, even though other than Tia Paul, I had no restaurant experience. And to be honest, like the experience I had there wasn't super helpful because it was a true fine dining restaurant with classic French service. And I was totally out of my depth and was pretty terrified working there, I would say, because it was all, it's nothing I'd ever seen before. Just even like, this is a sauce spoon, it's just like the way that service went.
Yeah.
And the amount of money people were spending and all that type of stuff. And so the first thing I learned, among many things, pretty quickly was that if you don't know about wine in that setting, you're pretty useless.
Yeah.
Right. Like it's kind of embarrassing when someone's like, hey, what do you think? I was thinking about the Sauvignon Blanc or the Viognier with the sea bass. And you're just like, I have no idea. Like,
sounds good.
Don't know what either of those are. I don't know. So I decided that I was going to learn as much about wine as I could.
Yeah.
It just seemed like the natural progression, because it became clear to me that if you want people to take you seriously or you want to have any success in that environment, you have to be wine knowledgeable, which doesn't necessarily mean becoming a sommelier, but it does mean having a really good foundation of wine knowledge. And the sommelier there, Roger DeGorn, is a master sommelier. And he took me under his wing, which isn't because I showed any special talent. It's basically, surprisingly, there aren't that many people, even in an environment like that, who are super into wine. Probably in a way, I don't know if in a way that maybe, I don't know if New York restaurants are still like this, but really pretty much everyone I worked with was a would-be actor or writer. So they really were about it. Like the flexibility, you make good money, you go to your auditions.
Yeah.
So there weren't that many. I would say there were career waiters there, but they were only career waiters because they never got their break.
Right.
Not because they were dedicated to the craft.
Right. They had not come there to be career raiders, but
and
wound up being that.
Exactly. And they weren't like, well, now that I'm here and I've been here this long, I should become a wine expert. I mean, they all knew enough to be able to, they always had a few wines that they knew or felt comfortable with just to kind of recommend to people. So anyway, Roger DeGorn suggested that I get my sommelier certificate from the American Sommelier Association, which I did. It was a crap ton of work. I mean, I think a lot of the people had worked in restaurants and knew more than I did. So I just kind of had to, in essence, learn about the entire world of wine, like all the countries. It was a lot. I think fortunately, like one area where I'm lucky, I just have a good memory, so a lot of it is, everyone thinks of wine like tasting, which is important, but in order to understand wine, you have to jam just a lot of what they would call wine theory into your head. You're like, what are the 20 major wine regions in Italy? And then, okay, within each of those 20 major regions, what are the subregions within each? Okay, in each subregion, what grapes are allowed? What alcohol percentages are required? What aging is required? What is the soil type? What is this? What is that? What's the history of the region, and so on and so forth. And then you just multiply, and that's just Italy. Granted, it's a big one. And then you're like, now you need to learn all of France, and you need to learn all of Spain, and you need to learn all of America, and South Africa, and New Zealand, and South America, and so on and so forth. So it's an endeavor, you know. But I had the good fortune of, I was committed to it. Like, I was just determined, and that's all I was doing. Like, I was working in restaurants, you're around wine all day, you go to your tasting groups, you go to your classes, you memorize stuff about wine, and it's like full immersion. And so
how long is that?
I was just in
is
it.
that like a 6-month process, a year
Yeah,
process?
it took me, so I never, by the way, you said master sommelier. I never became a master sommelier. There's an organization called the Court of Master Sommeliers, and I did the first 2 levels. The second level I passed is what made me a certified sommelier through the court.
Okay, certified sommelier. Okay.
It took, I mean, I guess I went, in 2 years, I went from literally not knowing anything about wine to having a job as a sommelier at a very large, successful restaurant in New York City.
Okay.
But I think it probably, I'm not saying like I'm special. I just think I have pretty high tolerance for pain. And I would like get home at 1 a.m. and study my flashcards till 4 a.m. and then go to sleep for 4 hours, and then wake up and go take a wine test, and then go work a double at a restaurant, and then come home late and study more flashcards. Like, so I packed a lot in. And I was around a lot of talented people who also were really serious as well. So it just became, you're just around it every day. You're in the restaurant 6 days a week, and people are constantly opening wine. You're asking questions about wine. You're tasting the wine that you're opening. You're going to a wine class. You're tasting more wine. You're studying your flashcards. You're meeting up with your friends in your blind tasting group. You're tasting more wine, and it's like I said, it was just true immersion.
Yeah, I think you still have a high tolerance for pain, man. You're a busy dude. You hustle. That's a good, hey, if you're doing what you do, that's important. That makes a difference. Well, then, so you're doing this. This has got to be getting closer to when y'all started having this bourbon conversation.
Yeah, I know. So I think your podcast's not long enough, because I did have some other steps. So the next step was, so I went from Chanterelle to a restaurant called Per Se. Per Se was, at the time, whatever, it was ranked the 8th best restaurant in the world, a 4-star restaurant. I was just trying to then take it like to the next level. Yeah. And then I ended up getting a job to be a sommelier at a restaurant called Blue Water Grill, which in Union Square, 16th and Union Square West, very more casual restaurant, but great wine lists, did $20 million in revenue a year. Like, it was a big, busy restaurant, and I really learned a ton there. Somewhere in all of this, and I can't pinpoint, it's hard for me to like say what was the moment. Although I think part of it was actually becoming a sommelier. When I actually had the job, it gave me a better understanding of what the future of that job would be. And to me, it was a little boring. Just like, yeah, like once again, maybe I get bored too easily, but I don't know. It's like, once you've tasted all the wines, like, people are ordering, like, oh, great, we're tasting 1961 Petrus, and we're tasting 1970 Margaux, and we're tasting 19 whatever Cheval Blanc, and and they're delicious. I'm not saying they're not, but you've tasted all the wines, and you've dealt with celebrities and challenging tables, and you've like done all these things. You can kind of, not that it would ever become an easy job, but you're kind of like, oh, so I'm just going to spend the rest of my life, being in charge of a wine list where I decide what wine goes on the list, training the staff, and then being on the floor and like taking care of the guests.
Yeah, you kind of you're up a steep learning curve for a while, and then
Yeah.
you get to a point where you're kind of going to plateau with what happens unless you go start a winery. I don't know.
Yes.
Like,
Yeah,
seems
you
like
could
that
do
would have been the
that.
next, like,
Exactly. But it's
or
also, I think at that point, I mean, there are always bigger jobs. Like you could be like, I'm the person that
yeah,
oversees this giant restaurant group, and there are 50, restaurants in the group, and then you're overseeing 25 sommelier. Like you could always, but then it would just become like a version of management,
you're
right?
back in corporate America at that point. Yeah,
Pretty much. Um,
yeah,
so what ended up happening was, and I think in no small part to, I mean, I think we're lucky. Tia Paul was lucky in so many different ways, but I think we're also lucky in that the restaurant was incredibly successful, which obviously isn't always the case. So it gave both my wife and myself not the idea that it was easy, but just that it's doable, right? Like you
yeah,
can open a restaurant and it can make money and be successful. And so I really um, I felt like that was the next step for me, was opening my own restaurant. And I think part of that too, right, is like I was talking mostly about the wine, but like we were just obsessed with restaurants, with the cult, and you're like checking every new restaurant that opens. And
yeah,
eventually, at least for me, I became pretty enamored with this idea of, well, what would my restaurant be?
yeah,
Like
right.
it's like a conversation. It's like because you talk to so many hospitality people, it's like you could give 10 different restaurateurs the exact same concept and it really would get executed 10 different ways. Like
Hmm.
it is an expression of creativity and your own philosophy and point of view,
Sure,
right?
absolutely. Yeah,
um, and that's what's super fun about it. And so um, I just got really set on this idea. It's like I want to do my thing, whatever that looks like. um, and there are two factors in how it turned out. One was, and this is also like very good fortune, my wife's business partner owned the building that Tia Paul's in, and he had another building in Brooklyn, in Cobble Hill. And, he and I had become good friends. And he knew that I now had like worked in these restaurants. And, he had partnered with his wife in one restaurant, my wife in another restaurant, and he wanted to do a third restaurant. And he asked me if I would open a restaurant um, at this location. And so this was the other kind of moment of serendipity. He's the one who really got me into bourbon. So he'd been a
mm,
bourbon collector way before people were collecting bourbon. Like he was collecting bourbon in 2002. I know from being in this space that most people got into collecting bourbon in like 2013. Or people are like, yeah, I've been
hmm,
into it for a while. I started collecting bourbon in 2017. The, you know, this guy was doing it in early 2000.
yeah,
And so while I was developing my palate around wine, he was like constantly tasting bourbon. So every time I would hang out with him, he's like, try this one, try this one, try this one. And, when you're used to tasting things, not just as a casual taster, but as someone who tastes things for a living, I was pretty intrigued by how high quality the bourbon was. Like I just got really enamored with it. I loved it. And he had amassed this collection that had become unwieldy. And so his only stipulation was that we incorporate this collection into the restaurant. And he was even saying, like, you can open a French bistro for all I care, but somewhere or another, we're like folding all these bottles in because they're taking up too much room in my house and like it's gotten absurd. And so I'm pretty sure I'll have to ask my wife, but I think she gets credit for this too. I remember kind of thinking that I should lean more into the wine thing and then the bourbon would be secondary. And she was pretty convinced that we really needed to lean into the bourbon piece and make it kind of central to what the restaurant was all about. She's from New Orleans, which is where we live now. And so I had also spent a lot of time in New Orleans and got really into um, just the food culture here and obviously the cocktails and everything that New Orleans is all about. And so the end result was this restaurant that we opened in the fall of 2008 called Char Number 4, which is named after the highest level of char that you typically find in a bourbon barrel. And it was essentially a wine bar with bourbon in the place of wine, right? So it was an encyclopedic selection of every American whiskey that it was available. I think at the time it was really one of the largest collections of American whiskey anywhere, at a bar or a restaurant. And I can say this like more as a point of fact than a brag. Like we knocked it out of the park. I had an amazing chef who'd worked for Daniel Boulud for 10 years, who was from Texas. He was tired of fine dining. He really wanted to do all this casual food, but with the technique of someone who knew how to make really great food. And just the combination of this sort of was kind of like a menu of the smoked, grilled, and charred flavors that go well with bourbon. But I guess you'd say it was like comfort food at a really high level: homemade bacon, homemade sausage, homemade lamb pastrami, half a smoked chicken. It was very creative without being fussy, and it was very. It's just the execution level was incredibly high. So we were named by New York Magazine one of the 10 best restaurants to open in New York that year, and we were the only restaurant in Brooklyn. So this is also before Brooklyn had kind of become this whole.
What year was this?
This was 08.
08, okay.
Yeah. And we were, GQ named us one of the 3 best places to drink bourbon in America. Although, as I always like to say, there were 5 places to drink bourbon, so it was like not a huge accomplishment. But we were really there.
Yeah.
At the beginning, like we were there before it blew up, and we were Esquire 50 best bars in America. I mean, we had no PR agency, and I think if you were to look at it now, it's like we got every awesome bit of press from every major publication that you could ever hope for.
Yeah, that's incredible.
And I think that it was both food as well. But we were the only ones doing this like huge bourbon collection focus, really. I mean, there were like a couple places in Kentucky. And even back then in Kentucky, you didn't really have places with these massive bourbon collections, right? It was like, it's hard to remember because now it feels like this big thing, but it really wasn't that long ago that, it wasn't normal even in Kentucky to be like, oh, look, they have 150 different bourbons, let alone 75. Like it was pretty.
No, you're right about that. I remember, it may have been 2010 ish, but I don't know if you ever ended up meeting Dave and Dana Query. I mean, I know y'all talked, but from Big Red F out there in Boulder.
Yeah, haven't met him in person yet. Yeah.
They had a place. He sold it, I don't know, 8 or 10 years ago. But it's called the Bitter Bar. He had some big bourbon collect. I mean, he's from Kentucky.
Yes.
And so that was sort of his. But there, I remember thinking at the time, I'm like, wait a minute, you have like why do you have all these bourbon? Like who really? You have all these bourbons? Like it was so weird and unique back then. You were. Well, good timing for that too. 2008, right after
it was. Yeah, yes.
I mean,
right? Like we opened 3 weeks before Lehman Brothers collapsed. Like we were, it was also scary, but then I guess everything was super affordable. Like the menu was affordable. And I think, I can't prove this, but I'd certainly never seen it. I think we were the first people to offer, because I mean, there weren't even that many bourbon bars. Everything was available as a 1 ounce taste or a 2 ounce pour.
Okay.
And there weren't really any expensive bourbons back then. So there were like, if you were to, I wish I could probably find a copy of that menu, but there were a lot of bourbons on our list that cost between $2 and $4 for a 1 ounce pour.
For a pour.
So at a time where it was, people were feeling like it was tight, you could go in there and like try 5 different bourbons and spend $14, so it ended up being good timing, I think.
Yeah, affordable food and people needed to drink then. It was a tough time, so that works out well.
Yeah.
But it sounds like y'all just knocked it out of the park with every aspect. Is it was it just American whiskey?
Yeah, so it's a good question. So what we did was, I actually remember thinking, I have no idea if this is going to work. Like, I don't know if anyone's, because I didn't know the whole bourbon collectors, and I just did, other than my friend that I opened the restaurant with, I didn't know anyone who was really into bourbon. So we were kind of questioning, like, I don't know if there's an audience for this. So, I built a really nice wine list, and we had whiskeys from around the world. There was vodka, gin, rum, tequila in the well, and we had, Scotch and Irish and Canadian and Japanese whiskey and all that type of stuff. Good selection of beer. So we were sort of like, hey, well, the worst case scenario is no one's really interested in all this bourbon. And then they can just, have a martini and order a bottle of wine. It's fine. Um, but the thing that we did, though, is all the other whiskeys were in drawers, and all of the other liquors were in the well. So the only thing you could see, though, was American whiskey when you walked in.
American whiskey.
It's just a big display behind the bar. And the cocktails were all only American whiskey cocktails.
Gotcha.
So we really leaned into it, into the terms of the design. We leaned into it in terms of the menu and the name of the restaurant. And so it was really centered around American whiskey. And I think we felt like we'd be able to pivot if we had to, but fortunately that wasn't the case.
Really, before I started the podcast and started realizing how ridiculously hard it is to successfully start and own and run a independent restaurant.
Oh, it's hard, yeah.
I used to think, like, I was like, I want to own a restaurant one day. Wes and I would talk about this. Wes is one of the partners here, and I was like, he used to drink Knob Creek back in the day. He really liked whiskey a lot, and I liked. I've always liked ribs. I was like, we're gonna name our place. We're gonna start one together, and we're gonna call it Ribs and Whiskey after the Widespread Panic song, and we're just gonna serve like really good ribs and meat, a bunch of whiskey. But it wasn't that many episodes in where I was like, dude, I'm not opening a freaking restaurant, but I like talking to people that do, because it's pretty impressive to be able to do that. I really do believe that. I think it's way, 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 way harder than most people think. Most people are like, oh, I know a lot about cooking, or I can cook good steak. I could open a steak place. Like, that's just, that's the classic, like, reason a lot of places don't make it. It's like, who cares? I mean, sorry, but if you can cook, that's great. But, opening and running a successful restaurant, bakery, coffee, whatever it is, it's freaking hard. It really is.
I think that it's the two things, right? One is, one, obviously operations. Typically it's way harder than anyone thinks, but that's one thing, like, that's surmountable, right? I mean, you can figure it out, and it'll never be easy. That's just the reality. But the other piece that I think people discount, and it's probably because it's the part that's the guesswork and you have to get lucky, is a good restaurant is like capturing lightning in a bottle. Like, there's something, I think we all know those places, and it could be a dive bar, and it could be a diner, and it could be a fine dining restaurant, and anything in between. But the places that are magic, it's all of it. It's the location they picked, it's the way the building sits on the block, it's the design, it's the name, it's the way service is executed. I mean, having good food and good drinks and even a good design is not nearly enough. Like, it somehow has to capture something special. And it has to make an emotional connection with people. And there are very successful restaurateurs who have proven time and time again that they can do it. And even those people have duds, which really just shows how much there's a little bit of, I mean, there's a skill, and the more skilled you are, the better your chances are of succeeding. But even those people just somehow make the wrong call.
All right, y'all, it is time for a little mid-episode break. We're going to talk about Kickfin. Thousands of restaurants, bars, and breweries use Kickfin to tip out their employees instantly. No cash required. With Kickfin, tips go directly to your employees' bank of choice the second their shift ends. It's a really simple solution to a really big problem, because if you're still paying out credit card tips in cash, it's costing you. Time-consuming bank runs and cash counting take managers away from work that matters. Cash is hard to track, which leads to accounting headaches, and it creates the perfect opportunity for theft, human error, and compliance issues. Bottom line, there's never been an instant, secure way to pay out tips until Kickfin. It's an easy-to-use software that sends real-time, cashless tip payouts straight to your employees' bank accounts, 24/7, 365. Kickfin gives managers hours back in their day, makes reporting a breeze, and protects your business from risk. Most importantly, employees love it. Restaurants can have Kickfin up and running overnight. Employees can enroll in seconds. No hardware, no contracts, no setup fees. Visit kickfin.com for a personalized demo. See how restaurants across the country are digitizing tips with Kickfin. All right, that's what they asked me to say, so I say it, and it tells the story very well, but I like to add this in. We referred a customer that we know and love very well, Sup Dogs, to Kickfin. Sup Dogs has been a customer for a super long time. Trust them very much with their opinion on these types of tools. They started using Kickfin. I asked Brett, the owner, recently how it's going. He said, Kickfin is perfect. It's going great. Exactly what we were hoping for. So there you go. Kickfin.com, y'all. Check them out. Yeah, I think, Charlie Munger passed away recently. And I know he was like, I was reading some of his stuff, and he was just talking about how anybody that's had success in business, sustained success and done a lot, like if they don't attribute any of it to luck, they're either,
Yeah.
naive or they're lying to, one of the both. I mean, it's just true. There's luck involved, but there's also learning from those duds. And I mean, I think just about every owner I know that's been at it a long time, that's had multiple restaurants, has had one that, didn't work for whatever reason.
Yeah.
But the best ones learn, figure out why, and they learn from that, and they get better, from that.
Yeah. And subsequent to char number 4, I opened another restaurant in Manhattan called Maysville, named after the port town on the Ohio River where, some think that's where bourbon was born, because Maysville was in old Bourbon County, and it was the first place that barrels were shipped out of Kentucky down the Ohio River to New Orleans. And so it's speculated that maybe the barrels said Old Bourbon whiskey on them because it was from Old Bourbon County. Again, no one can prove it, but it has a place in the history of bourbon. So that's why we called it Maysville. I opened that restaurant with a different chef, a guy named Kyle Knoll, who had worked at Gramercy Tavern, which is another, great New York restaurant. And, the short story is we had another huge success. We got a glowing 2-star review from Pete Wells, who's still the food critic for the New York Times. And again, we, because that was 2012, which is, I think, to me, more when things were really starting to blow up with bourbon.
Mm-hmm.
And now we were in Manhattan, and we were close to all the financial stuff and all the advertising and publishing houses. And so we were just packed and, getting accolades for the food. And it was really like char number 4, but, bigger bar, bigger wall of whiskey, and even in that 4 years, there was a lot more whiskey out there because of, as it became more popular, you're just seeing more craft distilleries, so on and so forth. And the last restaurant I opened was called Kenton's, with the same chef in New Orleans, which we opened in 2015. And that one, we got named by New Orleans Magazine Best New Restaurant in New Orleans. And the local food critic here, Brett Anderson, who's like the big food critic, gave us an incredible review. But anyway, not to get sidetracked, that one didn't do as well. It did really great the first year, and I think my wife and I, who did that one more together, even though she's from here, I think we kind of learned that we didn't understand some things about the market, both in terms of perception of guests and then just how small the local market is relative to the tourist market, and then what does it take in terms of name recognition or brand recognition to be able to pull. You get 20 million tourists, but if you're not, they have so many restaurants to go to, and if they're here to go to have gumbo and po' boys and go to Antoine's and Arnaud's and Galatoire's and all these classic places, why do they want to come to what ostensibly is kind of a more, again, it wasn't fussy, but what would feel like more of a modern Southern restaurant? And then you're not a name, you're not Donald Link or one of these revered chefs who are from here, so why is anyone going to choose you? And then if you're just duking it out from a local standpoint, there's just not enough to go around. Like, you need to be able to pull enough tourism. So anyway, we could spend 2 hours just on the postmortem of a failed restaurant, but that was the third. So we ended up opening those 3 restaurants. But in going back to where we started in 2010, I met Charles. I guess I met Charles in like 2008. He is good friends with our other co-founder, Jay Peterson, and Jay and his wife, Alice, and Alice is now the CEO of Pinhook, lived a block away from Tia Paul and were super regulars at Tia Paul. So that's how I got to know Jay and Alice, and in turn, how I got to know Charles, who I think the first time I met him, he came in with Jay to char number 4. And that friendship just led to, having dinner and really just having this conversation. As I said at the beginning, it's like, hey, we all love bourbon. Jay had gotten married in Kentucky. Charles was just a bourbon enthusiast and also a creative director and designer. I had the restaurant background, centered around both wine and bourbon. Jay had all this experience and love of Kentucky and also a business school guy. So it seemed like a good, we had 3 unique things to bring to it. And so we bought these barrels, these 20 barrels for $9,000 back in 2011. So we kind of conceived of the company in 2010 and we're like, hey, we're going to do this. And by 2011, after poking around, we were finally able to get our hands on some barrels and shipped them they were barrels from a distillery in Indiana, and we shipped them to Bardstown, Kentucky. And then really just started going to Kentucky 4 or 5 times a year to just hang out and just soak it all up because, bourbon can be made anywhere in the United States, but most of the people I meet think that it can only be made in Kentucky. And
yeah, let's take a, okay. So, cause I always thought that too, like that it had to be, but there's like specific criteria for it to be bourbon. It doesn't have to be Kentucky. What are the criteria for it to be?
So
bourbon?
Made in America.
Yeah.
And the Kentucky piece, honestly, is just because for a long period of time, 95% of the production was in Kentucky.
Was it Kentucky?
So most bottles that people saw said like Kentucky straight bourbon whiskey on it, like that. So that was really what drove it. And Kentucky does a good job marketing why they have such a special, climate and water and all of this. So Made in America, only 3 ingredients: water, grain, and yeast, which is important because other whiskeys are actually allowed to have other additives. It could be caramel coloring. It could be any number of things you might add to the whiskey, but bourbon is pretty pure in that way. It's just the 3 ingredients. It has to be aged in a new charred oak barrel. Probably easily the single biggest thing that distinguishes it from any other whiskey in the world is that it can't be a new toasted barrel. It can't be a used char barrel. It has to be a brand new barrel that is charred, and they light a fire inside of the barrel. And as I said,
an oak as well, white oak.
Has to be oak.
Okay.
I don't think they say white oak.
It's just oak. So you got to fell a tree and cut a barrel, and then you char it. And the 4 you said, are 4 was the highest number of charring.
It's like there's char. I think I've never heard of anyone using char 5. I think once you get past char 5, then the barrel will probably fall apart, because you're lighting a fire inside of the barrel. So char 1, char 2, char 3, char 4. Each one is a thickness of, I think char 4 is a 1/4 inch thick of char into the barrel. Like if you saw a cross section. And the fact that the barrel's new and the fact that it's has been charred is just going to give it a lot of sweetness.
Yeah. Okay.
Right. As opposed to a used barrel. The other factor is it has to be 51% corn in the mash bill, which are the mix of grains that you use when you make your distillate. So
51% exactly, or 51% or more?
51 minimum.
Minimum. Okay. Got it.
Yeah. So you can use 75 corn, like our mash bill is 75% corn, 15% rye, and 10% barley. But someone else could be like, we're going to use 60% corn and 20% barley and 20% rye. And someone else could say, we're going to use 60% corn and 30% wheat and 10% barley. Like you can, as long as you're using 3 grains and as long as corn is 51% of it, then you can call it bourbon.
Okay. Got it. Got
And
it.
as long as it's made in America, right? So you could do that in Colorado or North Carolina or wherever you want.
Okay. So
So
you bought these
yes,
barrels.
yes. Yeah. And then we were just like, we want to hang out in Kentucky. Like Jay had spent a lot of time there. I had spent some time there, but we're just like, we're going to visit distilleries and just, kind of soak up the magic, and just learn more about it. And, you know, but I guess to step back for one sec, right? The main thing in terms of my approach was in terms of what we were going to do differently is typically all bourbon is made as a homogeneous flavor profile. So a distillery decides, maybe they'll have a series of SKUs. They decide this is what it tastes like. And their goal is to replicate that, right? There's nothing wrong with that. And a lot of people make really good whiskey that way. What seemed really interesting to me, and also the thing I was curious about, was why can't you make it like wine, where you look at your mature barrels like you would your harvest of grapes, and each year you make the best thing you can. And there's
Mm.
variation from one vintage to the next. And so that's
Okay.
really still the unique selling proposition, I guess, to use a businessy term, of Pinhook, is we make vintages and I blend the best thing I can. And so if you were to buy bottles of Pinhook from, let's say, the same expression, like we make our most popular bourbon is the orange wax, which is we call it our flagship bourbon or our everyday bourbon. If you were to taste that 6 different vintages of it, and you really wanted to dig in and taste them side by side, you'd see that they actually taste quite a bit different from each other. So we're kind of, and it goes back to what you were saying, right? Each barrel, the standard barrel is 53 gallons. It's made from wood. No two trees are exactly the same. And so imagine each one of these 53-gallon barrels, which typically are coming from different trees. It could be the same type of tree, but it's not the actual same tree. Water's evaporating from the barrel, depending on the temperature. Alcohol's evaporating from the barrel. Oxygen's getting into the barrel. Each one is its own little chemistry set or,
Mm-hmm.
unique aging environment. And so barrels that were filled with the exact same distillate, like the same distillation run,
Mm-hmm.
can all taste really different from each other. And so typically what's happening is, if you think of it like a jigsaw puzzle where you're like, okay, the barrels I'm dumping for this batch are not the same barrels I had from the last batch, because the last batch of barrels are empty. I need to figure out how to make the next batch taste like the prior batch.
Mm.
And then what most of the brands are doing is basically doing that forever. Like that process never ends. And they work really hard to come up with a formula for how you do that consistent taste profile. And it's really, the way I always explain it to people, it's really just philosophy, right? I don't ever make the claim we do it this way and therefore our product tastes better than other people's. My point of view is more like, I just thought it would be really interesting to do it the opposite way.
Yeah.
And to make it more of a natural expression of the variety and variability that you find in whiskey. And so using it as an opportunity to express the uniqueness that exists in barrels, as opposed to just replicating the same taste over and over and over again. And so I think if people are into Pinhook, that's what's appealing to them. It's like, oh, I think it's really cool that you guys are just trying to make the best thing you can every year. And that you don't go into it already knowing what it's going to taste like.
How
You just let the best thing come together.
how do you educate your consumers about that? I mean, I'm
It's hard.
because the industry does it generally. I mean, maybe there's others that do it like you. I don't know, but I mean, generally, I like whatever it is. I don't know, Buffalo Trace. So every Buffalo Trace bottle from every year from is going to taste pretty much exactly the same, and that's what I expect. I have a level of expectation. It's always going to taste the same. How do you share that story and tell that story and educate the consumer
It's a good
of
question.
your philosophy?
Yeah. So,
Because it's really cool, but it seems like it'd be hard to create that to tell that story at scale.
so the good news is and I say this very respectfully, most people don't really taste anything that critically, right? Like,
No, you're exactly like I don't. I wouldn't notice. I wouldn't notice if one bottle of any kind was different, maybe. But I think that
right.
this. But what you just told me makes what you do very interesting to me as somebody who doesn't have that palate that would notice it.
Yes.
But now I'm like, well, see, that's cool because that's a different story and that's something unique that this cool brand Pinhook's doing. So I'm kind of interested, and now maybe I even want to actually taste different bottles because I want to see if I can even taste the different.
Yeah.
Like, that's really freaking cool.
Yeah. So
Um,
here's the tough part. So the one reality of it, right, is you don't as much have to worry about the fact that someone might be not like the idea of it tasting different, because we do make significant changes to our label each year, including putting a vintage date on it and putting a different geometric pattern on it inspired by Jockey's Filk. So if you looked at 6 different vintages of our orange wax, you would see
your flagship.
our 6 different vintages of our flagship. You would see 6 different horses, because every year there's a new active racing thoroughbred on the bottle.
Okay.
You would see
Okay.
6 different shapes, and you'd see a different vintage date. However, I think with that product just sitting on the shelf and no one explaining it to them, I think people would probably just are used to grabbing the orange and maybe aren't even noticing that there's some sort of difference in the label. And and then because of what I said, they're unlikely to taste the difference. Also, because they're unlikely to bring them home and taste 2 side by side. I'm going to compare these 2 next to each other. But that said, to your point, it is the thing that makes us unique. So from the standpoint of the shelf, I mean, we have a QR code. We do put the vintage on it. Like, we're trying to signal all these things that might make people curious about, oh, I bought this bottle. It looks different than last time. Let me learn more. Obviously, if you go to our website, you get all that information. But the rest of it is just the ongoing, well, doing a podcast, doing consumer tastings, doing in-store tastings, doing whiskey dinners, um, trying to tell that story on, through social media. Um, and yeah, I would say the best thing about Pinhook is also the worst thing about Pinhook. I mean, the more you dig in, the more nuanced it is, and the more layers there are to the story. But it also takes time to tell it.
Mm,
It's like, I mean, the easy part of the
yeah.
story is to tell, just to say like, hey, we don't replicate a flavor profile. Every year we just make the best whiskey we can. But then you get into, well, why is it called Pinhook, and what's the deal with the horses, and so on and so forth. And so going back to the story, what ended up happening was Jay's best friend from high school, this guy Jamie Hill, grew up in thoroughbred horse racing, lives in Lexington, Kentucky, ended up being in thoroughbred horse racing himself. And we would always stay at Jamie's house when we went to just hang out. And so he just started showing us his world, right? And that wasn't because we had some intent of connecting the two. We actually originally had a bunch of different ideas around, well, we want to make the best thing we can each year, essentially making an annual vintage as you would with wine. But like, what is that? What do you call that? What does that look like? Et cetera, et cetera. And what we just started seeing is there are all these natural parallels between bourbon and thoroughbred horse racing and bourbon. And so one was, we learned that Jamie, a big part of his what he does in thoroughbred horse racing is called pinhooking. And in thoroughbred horse racing, a pinhook is when you buy a baby thoroughbred based on its lineage to hopefully sell it for a profit when it's mature. So you're buying something young, hoping to sell it for a profit when it's mature. And that's a pinhook. As I've later learned, meeting all sorts of people, there are a bunch of other industries that use the term pinhook. It's a tobacco industry term. I literally heard for the first time, I was in Tennessee and someone's like, oh, that's not a pinhook. What a pinhook is when you buy a steer and then you try to sell the steer for more than you paid for it. And then I met someone in the logging industry who's like, I'd never heard of pinhooking horses, and I hadn't heard of pinhook bourbon. But we talk about, we'll cut down a tree, and instead of turning it into lumber, we'll try to flip it to another lumber yard for a profit, and that's called a pinhook. So anyway, the dots we connected is no one had ever made a bourbon called Pinhook, and so we're like, we're pinhooking bourbon. We're buying something immature, like a young bourbon, to
Mm-hmm.
sell it when it's older. The other part that was really important about that was we were doing that at a time where it was really atypical to be transparent about the fact that you did not have a distillery. And I always thought that was silly. And we were really focused. Another big part of Pinhook, which again, not something that's as much like consumer facing, was this idea of pure transparency, which is to say there's absolutely, we will tell you literally anything you want to know. There are no secrets. Like, I can't tell you that, can't tell you this. And so we also love the idea that we were building into our name the idea that we were telling people in our name, well, I mean, we'd have to explain the name first, but telling them that, like, we're not distillers. We don't want to distill. No one's science minded, you know, like, it's not what we're interested in doing. We don't want to, we're not chemical engineers. Like, we just want to be responsible for, it would be like, I want to be a great chef. It doesn't mean I want to like raise cattle or grow vegetables necessarily. It's like, I don't necessarily want to have a farm. I just like, bring me the beef and then I'll butcher it, or better yet, bring it to me butchered and I'll make the best thing I can. So that was a big part of it. Jamie also has a racing stable called Bourbon Lane Stable. That stable already existed. And he names all of the horses in his stable with bourbon in the name of the horse. And he was just doing that because he thought it was good marketing. He was like, well, if you're anywhere in the world and you see a horse racing and it says there's bourbon in the name. And so just to give you an idea, like, our first releases, the first Pinhook releases, which were all connected to different thoroughbreds, there was Bourbon Courage, Bourbon Eyes, that's all one word, IZE, hashtag Bourbon, Urban Bourbon, Bent on Bourbon, Bourbon Empire, Bourbon Resolution. Like, these are all actual horses, some
Actual
of which
horses
were successful, some not so much. And so the idea that we came to Jamie with was to say, because horses like bourbon are about this idea of lineage, like, where did this come from? But just because you know the lineage of a horse doesn't mean it's going to be successful, right? There's like an element of luck. And just because you know where a bourbon was made, it doesn't mean that that barrel or the way it comes together will be great. In order to reinforce the idea of that, and also just uniqueness, that our whiskey doesn't always taste the same, and horses are these unique animals with personalities, and our whiskeys have personalities, you know, the personality of the way it tastes. We asked Jamie, would you pick an unproven thoroughbred every year, and that thoroughbred goes on our label? And part of the fun of that was Maker's Mark does a commemorative bottling for the Derby winner or like a Triple Crown winner, but it's like the horse was already a winner, and then doing the bottling after the fact is more like doing something commemorative. We were like, how cool would it be to connect our whiskey to actual thoroughbreds who are yet to prove that they're actually good thoroughbreds, but that you could actually go to the track and watch them race and place a bet on them, or you could watch them on TV and place a bet on them. And it was really, because we were having a lot of fun times at Keeneland, which is the track in Lexington. And so really making it experiential in a way. The other thing that was really interesting to us, I think you'll find this interesting as a marketing person, was most of what we'd seen in the world of bourbon is it's a story. Like, there's a story, but the story is over. Like, nothing will ever happen ever again. It's like, this whiskey is called Old Overholt, and it's named after the so-and-so. This is called Jim Beam, and Jim Beam was the first generation of the Beam family who came from blah, blah, blah. But then, like, it doesn't go anywhere. Like, the story already happened. And so, and a lot of credit to Charles, and Jay's a good marketing person as well, was the idea that we have a story that never ends. Yeah. Like, the whiskey is always evolving.
Yeah.
The horses on the whiskey are always different. Maybe one day one of these horses will be a champion, maybe not. But that it's constantly changing. It doesn't ever stop. And that was the part that was really exciting to us, and still is that it doesn't have, like, I mean, every year it will taste different, and every year there will be a different horse. And hopefully, and I think this is kind of goes back to the restaurant thing, you're trying to make an emotional connection in some way. And the emotional connection that you get with wine that you typically don't get with bourbon is the idea that something won't exist again. and I don't mean just in the sense of it being, it's not about it being, you know, limited or scarce. It's just the fact that that thing was only made one time. Maybe it was made in large quantities, but it will never exist again. Like once it's gone, it's gone. And I think that's part of the appeal of wine. It's like you go on your honeymoon to Sonoma and you go to this really cool winery and you buy these bottles, then you drink them over the course of a couple few years. And then once those bottles are gone, they can never be replaced. And I think the way you feel connected to something that you know there's a finite amount of is very different than you're like, oh, then I could just go back to the store whenever I want and buy another bottle of Maker's Mark, right? I mean, it will always be there and it will always taste the same. And so I think we were trying to get to something around, and that's where what Charles did so well with the different geometric shapes is like they're easily identifiable. Like if you had a bunch of even one expression, again, like the flagship, they all look different from each other. And then you could look at that bottle and be like, oh, I've only got, a third of a bottle left of 2023. And it was one of my favorites of all time. It's like that
Yeah.
relationship to the product, I think to me is going to be very different than if it's, you can always find it, or B, even if it was like some super limited thing and they only made 800 bottles. That's different. That's a different thing to me. That's like scarcity, right?
Yeah.
Or
Yeah.
lack
Yeah.
of
Right. Right. That's
availability.
supply and demand. Yeah.
That's supply and demand. But this is different. This is more like, this one felt special to me for some reason. Like I felt I just really liked it, or there was something about the bottle, or I thought the name of the horse was really cool.
Or you get
And
connected with a horse. Yeah. Right.
yeah, and that's so that's the part to me that always makes me feel like I'm still in the hospitality business. Is I'm really thinking about the experiential side of it,
Man.
not just the
Yeah.
production. Because I don't think we're not.
Yeah.
That's where we really differentiate ourselves, and we're not the only. I mean, we're not the only people that don't have a distillery, but we're not really. I think if you're in production, then everything is like we get our grain from here, and our still is this type of still, and it's really focused on like you're a manufacturer.
Mm.
And I don't think we're manufacturers. I think we're trying to tell a story through whiskey, which ultimately also needs to taste good.
The the opportunity you give to people that run bourbon clubs or bartenders that have, a stout bourbon collection or a whiskey collection. I mean, that's really cool because you give them, hey, let me, somebody that's really interested. That's a super interesting story. If it's just somebody that's just coming in and really doesn't care, just give me a bourbon. I don't care. Okay,
Yep.
fine. But many, many people are very dialed into bourbon and they attach themselves to a brand or some brands, or they have some reason they like some bourbon, but yours, that's just such a unique thing. I mean, this is like, it's at the ongoing. It's like you become part of the story almost. Like I got my first bottle this year with this
Yeah.
horse, and wait till the year one of your horses wins Belmont or something like that.
Well, that's the thing, right? I mean,
like,
and that was the other area that we really wanted to be authentic too. Is like, we always try to give Jamie a lot of grief. Like, well, come on, dude, where's our, big champion thoroughbred? And he's always, there are 25,000 foals born in Kentucky each year. There are 20 slots in the Kentucky Derby. Like,
yeah,
it's similar to sports, right? I mean, being a Division I college football player is already really, really short odds. And then the odds
yeah,
of going from D1 to being an NFL player are, right? I mean, it's like, it's tiny, tiny, right? So it's similar with the horses, but it would be even that much more exciting if one of them, and some of them, like actually the horse on our current flagship is a horse named Bourbon Resolve. Bourbon Resolve ran second to Mage, who won the Kentucky Derby in a couple races this year, but in the end didn't perform well enough in enough races to get enough points to even become close to going to the Kentucky Derby. But like, they're in the mix, right? I mean,
yeah.
he was racing against the Derby winner and performing well. So, you know, it's hopefully just a matter of time. Um, But man, even if it took 20 years, like how sweet would that be if one day there's like all these years later, you finally have that horse and it's in the Derby, and then, well, I mean, what if it actually won? It would be pretty slim odds, but
Yeah, but even this, and look, you've got. So I'm interested now in just, okay, I want to get a bottle and figure out. Okay, so here's the horse's name. Like,
yeah,
well, let me start following that horse. You're marrying, I mean, because these things are married together in a lot of ways anyway. Kentucky and bourbon and horse racing or whatever. But then you probably get people that don't pay attention to or barely pay attention to horse
yeah,
racing, or maybe they watch the Derby every year that now have some reason to kind of follow it and get engaged. And you're kind of betting. I mean, there's all this betting in horse racing. You're kind of starting to bet on your, like, I know who I'm cheering for in this race. Where otherwise it was like, I mean, we sit down every year. We watch the Kentucky. We just literally pick a name. Like, oh, that's a cool name. Like, it'd be
of
cool
course.
in any race or whatever to start like, oh, that's my horse. Like, I have some connection to that horse. So you're not okay. So you're not distilling.
Not distilling.
You're buying, and you are creating a certain amount that you go sell every year. And you did how many barrels last year? You said, or this year?
Last
1,200.
year we dumped 1,200 barrels.
1,200 barrels.
Yeah.
Okay.
Which again, I mean, just to create some context, I bet the big guys dump in 1,000 barrel batches, and they probably have to do like, I use Maker's Mark because everyone knows it, like, and because it's like a small batch whiskey, or it's sort of presented as being craft. They probably have to dump 1,000 barrels 3 times a week.
3 times a week.
Yeah, I would think so.
Okay.
I mean, it's
So
the scale is
150,000,
massive.
160,000, whatever a year. And
Yeah, it's
yeah,
a lot.
yeah.
Yeah. So
Uh,
what we do is we're not teeny tiny, but it's small.
mm-hmm. No, for sure. I mean, I know we talked before you had gotten into whatever it was, some X number of states, 20 something states or whatever, but
Mhm.
you were getting a little bit more focused on certain ones.
Yeah, I mean, I think you know it's a learning process. I think the easiest way to grow is to just go into new markets. But then, to what you and I were talking about, if you have to educate, and if the education has to be spread out over that many states, it would take you an awful lot of people, and your distributor's not really going to do much of that education. It really falls on you as the brand. So I think it's the thing that took us a long time to figure out, even though I guess you could say it's pretty simple. Is like, I think we asked the question for a long time and it took us a while. The question is, should you go deeper or go wider? Right. And I think in the end, we figured out you need to go deeper, because you can jump into a new market, get people really excited, have an initial pop, and then get it into what in the industry we would call, like, you fill the pipeline, like you get it on the shelves. But in order to be successful, it has to come off the shelf, or what they call pull through or sell through, and then it has to be replenished. And unless you have a lot of recognition, name recognition, the pull through is hard. Or
Mm.
you might get the initial pull through, and it's not that um, people didn't like the product, but they have so many other choices, so you don't get the second bottle sale. And so maybe it does, like, the pipeline's filled, the shelves are somewhat cleared, the shelves get replenished, but then getting the next round of pull would mean that you'd have to introduce it to more consumers. And the beauty, or the maddening part of this industry, depending on your perspective, and you kind of have to embrace the grind of it, is that there's, I mean, except for the extreme rare cases of like George Clooney with Casamigos or something like that, there's no magic bullet. It's one bottle at a time, one account at a time, one person at a time. You just have to go around, tell the story, and it's not like you could just do one move and then all of a sudden, like, it's all these magical things that can happen. Like, you go out every day, and that's the part that it reminds me of a restaurant. It's like, a restaurant is the ultimate, and I don't mean grind in the negative sense,
No,
right? I
it's
mean,
just that. It's
It's
not going to go onto autopilot. You got to
it, there's yeah,
keep cranking it every day.
it doesn't run itself. You get up and you just do some version of the same thing over and
Yep.
over and over again. Um, and I mean, with restaurants, I would always say it's like you could have the best night in the restaurant that it's ever had in terms of like the quality of the service, maybe your revenue, you know, the timing of the kitchen, all these types of things. And you wake up the next day and you're right back at zero.
Yeah. Yep.
Right. It's a new day, mostly different people coming into the restaurant. And you don't really get to take anything from the night before except for like, hey, that was a great night. You know, maybe you can try to, you know, reinforce good habits and figure out why things went so well. But on balance, you're just starting again at zero. And same thing too, you can work really hard to get an account, like let's say a retail shop, an independent retail shop, and there could be someone, and it could be a relationship that you build and they love Pinhook, and then the person who's the buyer decides that they leave the store, and maybe they even leave the industry, and now there's a new buyer and you don't know that new buyer. And so then, you know, the cliche of this industry is that it's a relationships business. It's just all the relationships you have with your distributor, with your consumers, and with the with your distributor.
You know, with very, very few exceptions, overnight successes, and this is in almost any industry, in any kind of business, overnight successes happened for decades before they were an overnight success, right?
Yeah,
Like,
yeah,
I mean, the whole hockey stick growth thing. I have a buddy who wrote a book called The Hockey Stick Principles, and he just talks
yeah,
about like before you hit that nonlinear growth where it really starts to accelerate and you're going up
yeah,
the
yeah,
shaft, you have the
yeah,
blade years, as he calls them. And the
yeah,
blade years are just, you don't know when the blade years are going to end, and this stuff's going to start to kind of build on itself, and the
yeah,
momentum's so big. But the blade years can be long, and that's where most people drop off because you don't see that, you know, 1+1 = 3 right away. 1+1 might equal 2, and sometimes not even that early on. And it's just a matter of just continuing to, like you said, wake up every day. I mean, we've been doing it for 16 years at Schedule Fly. You know,
yeah,
we wake up every day, we tell the same story, we do the same thing, and then just little by little over time, you make. I mean, just this relationship, right? Like, you know, you find new people that have a similar ethos and share interests and contacts, and somehow those things, you know, somehow serendipitously seem to lead to good things, and you just have to have enough of that. But you have to do it long enough and just stick with it
mm-hmm,
long enough, and that's hard to do. That's hard to do in your business. It's hard to do in ours. It's hard. I mean, it really is. But that tends to be the differentiator in a world like yours or ours, and you're you know, you guys are. I'm glad you're going instead of the short of the shallow and wide, that the narrow and deep. I think that's really smart. There's the best business advice I ever got. My previous business was focus, 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 dominate, 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 and that was again a totally different
yeah,
industry, but it helped us realize like we were trying to sell this content we had to like anybody and everybody, and we're like, no, 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 no. Like this is the audience we should focus on, and like let's just crush it with that audience, and then if we do that, then we can try another audience where yours is more geographically maybe like let's effing kill it in New York or
yeah,
Louisiana, whatever the states are, North Carolina, and just dominate there, because then that stuff starts to, things happen, spring from that, you know, that you can't even account for. I mean, look at the largest American brewery, American owned brewery, is Yingling. And Yingling's Pottsville, Pennsylvania, they're only on the East Coast, but they're the,
yeah,
you know, because they're all the other ones sold out to overseas. But you know, they're like, dude, we're not going like west yet because we still got to, like, we still got room to grow on the East Coast. And we all know Yingling here, but you go to California, they're like, oh, I've heard of Yingling. I can't get that here. And you kind of want it. So you want to, you know, and then you go to, like, it seems like that's a cool way that they've grown that. And, you know, that's a massive, you know, huge brand now, but it's only on the East Coast.
yeah. We really started in like New York, New Jersey, Kentucky, Louisiana, and Mid Atlantic.
Mm.
And I don't know. It's, I mean, it's this isn't quite right, but I would probably now almost say like we should probably still just be in those markets.
Yeah.
Because it's just like every market you go into, it's like it takes time and attention away from somewhere else. And when you're small, there are only so many people, so many resources, both people and dollars. And you know, you you're focusing less on this thing to focus on this other thing. And then to your point about Yingling, it's like you were not even close to where you could be
Right.
in the place you already are. And then you already go somewhere new. And then you're sacrificing the momentum that you were building originally. And then it's hard to go back and like get it kick-started again. You know what I'm saying? So um, it's a good lesson, but I don't know. Like you said, you're going to make lots of mistakes, and some of the mistakes we made, you can be forgiven for making because the distributor's calling you and being like, "We're going to crush it. Like we will sell
Right.
1,700 cases in our first year.
Yeah.
People are, everyone's clamoring for Pinhook. Please, 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 please." And it's hard not to feel flattered by that. And also like, yeah, we're going to sell more. But then that's a market you need to visit and train people and do consumer tastings. And there are only so many hours in the day. And when you're small, like I was saying, only so many people. And then you're spread too thin is probably the simplest way of thinking about it. And as you get spread thin, the place you'd spend all this time building momentum and energy, you're kind of taking away from that,
You're yeah, man. It's tough to say no.
It's
I mean,
really hard to say no.
particularly when you come from hospitality. That's like, you try to find a way to say yes, like make things happen. And yeah, but y'all are, man, I love what I see with what y'all are doing, man. And you are learning and getting better each time I talk to you. And I mean, you've got some markets that, like where are there really good independent restaurants? And, obviously New York and Louisiana, and
Yep.
there are a lot in Kentucky too. There's a lot of good food there. I know you're in Colorado. I mean, Colorado, God, man, I can't say enough about all the freaking independent restaurants out in Colorado, which is really where like they tell good stories. They get it. They understand what something like your brand means. And I don't know why it is in just certain states where you find certain types of people, and then they probably sell to a consumer that's interested in something like that too. But, well, look, okay. Let's see here. So I'm talking to Neil in 30 minutes, I believe.
Yep.
Is that right? Yeah.
Yeah.
He's a buddy of yours, right?
Yeah. Yeah. He's the best.
What do I need to know about him? What should I ask him about?
It's a good question.
Like something random.
Well, to be honest, it's funny. Well, he worked for the same restaurant group that I did in New York, a restaurant group called Be Our Guest.
Be Our Guest.
Yeah, but he has another fun. I was talking to him about it not too long ago, and I don't remember all the details, but he had another one of those fun, like, things going, just like a little bit lost at sea, kind of like I was, and then somehow, finding his way. But I think he really brought cocktails to, this has always been like an epicenter of cocktails, but Cure is really, I think they really put New Orleans on the map in terms of the modern cocktail scene,
Yeah.
But yeah, you'll love him. He's such a good guy.
Well, so I got to get down there. Maybe I'll get down to the spring and I'll bring my bride and we'll hang for a couple of days. I was going to stay at Dave and Dana's house. They offered that up.
Nice.
I do want to get down there because I want to meet Neil in person. I don't know if you're going to be over there any year. Dave Nitzel was there. I think y'all met at the Tales of the Cocktail thing.
Yeah, I met him briefly. Yeah.
He's got a book called Hospitality DNA that I highly recommend. Phenomenal book. Neil was in it. That's how they got to know each other.
Oh, nice.
And then we got to get you, you got some socks.
I got my schedule fly socks.
I saw that, dude. Look at that. We got matching socks, man. Did you see I
Got
had
my
mine
schedule.
on?
Yeah.
Oh man, I
Oh,
love it. Those things are cool. They're comfortable.
they're super comfortable. I love them.
I love your hat. You know, your hat is funny. Your hat reminds me of the like it looks a lot like a cricket hat, which is ironic because we got to get you and Hobson talking cricket. I think you
We
nailed it. I
do.
think that'd be a great brand for y'all to affiliate with.
You know what's funny? I bought this hat from Huckberry, and it was like a Coors hat, and I took the patch off of it and put a pin. Because
And
sometimes,
you put the Pinhook on.
yeah,
Yeah.
because a friend of mine who's in the industry, like he makes apparel, he's just like all the good stuff goes to the brands. You know what I mean?
Uh huh.
Like you can't get like you can't get like this hat. Like I figured it out is like it's not like some company like Richardson. Like it doesn't
Yeah.
have a name on it. Like it was
It's like Patagonia
manufactured.
hats. That's
Yes,
right.
exactly. It
I
was
tried to get Patagonia to tell me where they made their hats, and they're like,
Yeah,
I was like,
exactly. You're like, your hats
nope.
are awesome. Your hats
Yeah,
are
they have the
awesome. And they're
perfect
like,
fit and everything. Yeah.
all right, I got to run to this
Yeah.
tasting. That was awesome.
That was fun, man.
That was
That
really
was fun
fun.
for sure.
We'll have
Well,
to do. But yeah,
you come,
we need to get you down here.
I want to get down there. We'll probably come in the spring and hang out for a few days. And then if you're ever, next time you're coming up towards Charlotte or Raleigh or something, let me know. We'll hang.
Okay. Awesome.
All right, man.
All right, brother.
See you,
Take care
brother.
of yourself.
Appreciate
All
it.
right, bye.
All right. Later.